By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
The rain in Lochdubh did not fall. It drifted in a grey, melancholic, horizontal sheet that blurred the line between the sky and the cold, salt-stung waters of the sea loch. To a tourist, it was atmospheric. To PC Hamish Macbeth, it was a blessing. It was the kind of weather that kept the ambitious, the law-abiding, and, most importantly, his superiors in Strathbane indoors. Hamish sat on a damp rock by the edge of the Andun forest, his lanky frame draped in a waterproof that had seen better decades. His shock of ginger hair was plastered to his forehead, and his hazel eyes were fixed with predatory intensity on a swirling pool in the river. Beside him, Lugs, a dog of indeterminate breed and even more indeterminate morals, sat with his ears pricked, occasionally letting out a low, pessimistic whine. "Wheesht, Lugs," Hamish whispered. "If the water bailiff hears you, we'll both be eating tinned beans tonight instead of a fine bit of silver." With a flick of his wrist, the line went out. Hamish Macbeth was a man of many talents, but his greatest was the ability to look entirely idle while being remarkably productive in the pursuit of his own comfort. To the casual observer, he was a lazy village bobby who could barely be bothered to lace his boots. In reality, he was simply a man who had realised that in the Highlands, if you did your job too well, they rewarded you with a promotion to a grey office in a grey city, a fate Hamish considered worse than the gallows. A sudden splash, a tug, and the battle was on. 5 minutes later, a plump salmon lay on the moss. "There now," Hamish said, a slow, deceptive smile spreading across his thin face. "A gift from the loch. We'll just drop this by the back door of the hotel, and Mrs. Curry might find it in her heart to provide us with a breakfast that doesn't involve my own cooking. However, the peace of the Highlands is a fragile thing, usually shattered by the arrival of someone with a southern accent and a sense of vision." As Hamish made his way back toward the village, keeping to the shadows of the dry stone walls, he saw it, a garish, silver Range Rover, polished to a shine that insulted the drab Highland morning, idling outside the Lochdubh Hotel. Emerging from the vehicle was a man who looked like he had been curated by a London department store for the express purpose of country living. He wore a crisp, brand-new Barber jacket, leather boots that had never touched mud, and a flat cap positioned at an angle that suggested he'd seen it in a film. This was Julian Sterling. He had arrived 3 weeks ago, having bought the old McRae croft on the hill. He hadn't bought it to farm, of course. He had bought it to rewild it, which, in local terms, meant letting the thistles grow so high they choked the neighbours' grazing land and telling the locals that their ancestors had mismanaged the ecosystem. "Macbeth!" Sterling shouted, spotting the copper's ginger head over a wall. "Officer, a word!" Hamish sighed, adjusted his hold on the damp sack containing his poached prize, and assumed his most vacant expression. He leaned heavily on his crook, looking for all the world like a simpleton who had just been startled by a loud noise. "Oh, hello there, Mr. Sterling," Hamish drawled, his Highland lilt thickening to a syrup. "It's a grand morning, is it no? It's tipping it down, man. And more importantly, my driveway has been blocked again by that ginger-bearded menace, Archie McLean. His sheep are everywhere. My yoga retreat guests arrive on Friday, and the place smells like a wet rug. Sheep will be sheep," Hamish said mildly, "and Archie's been grazing that hill since before the Queen's coronation. It's the ancient rights, you see. I don't care about ancient rights. I care about my property values. This village is a picturesque backdrop, Macbeth, not a barnyard. I've already contacted the council about the noise from the pub, and I expect you to do something about McLean's livestock." Sterling looked at Hamish with a mixture of pity and contempt. To Sterling, Hamish was a relic, a slow-witted local official who probably couldn't find his own hat without a map. "I'll certainly have a wee word with Archie," Hamish lied effortlessly, though he's a hard man to find when the weather's like this. Usually bides in the bottom of a bottle of Talisker when the wind's from the east. Just see that it's done. I didn't move to the Highlands to be harassed by peasants. Sterling turned on his heel and marched into the hotel, his boots clicking loudly on the pavement. Hamish watched him go, his eyes narrowing. The Sassenach had managed to offend every person in Lochdubh within 21 days. He had complained about the smell of peat smoke, the timing of the church bells, and the limited selection of organic kale at the local stores. "He's a man with a target on his back, Lugs," Hamish murmured to the dog. "In a village this small you canna call the folk peasants and expect to get invited to the Sealid." Hamish turned toward the kitchen entrance of the hotel, hoping to trade his salmon for a pot of strong coffee before the inevitable explosion of trouble. He could feel it in the air, a tension that was sharper than the wind off the Minch. Lochdubh was a peaceful place, but it was a peace built on long memories and short tempers, and Julian Sterling was currently standing in a puddle of kerosene, looking for a match. The kitchen of the Lochdubh Hotel was a sanctuary of steam, the scent of frying fat, and the comforting rumble of Mrs. Curry's complaints. Hamish sat at the scrubbed wooden table, his long legs tucked back to avoid Lugs's tail, which was thumping rhythmically against the floorboards. In front of him sat a plate of the poached salmon, flaked and scrambled with eggs, accompanied by a thick slice of buttery toast and a mug of coffee so strong it could have stripped paint from a trawler. "He's a nasty piece of work, that Sterling," Mrs. Curry remarked, slamming a heavy iron frying pan onto the stove. "Telling me my haggis is unethical, in my own kitchen. I've been making haggis since before he was a glint in a stockbroker's eye. He has a way of making folk feel like they're a nuisance in their own skin," Hamish agreed, closing his eyes as he took a blissful forkful of fish. "But he's got money, and the council likes money. They think he'll bring wellness tourism to the glen. As if the Highlands aren't healthy enough without folk in lycra doing the downward dog on a peat bog." He was halfway through his second cup of coffee, contemplating the profound joy of a day with absolutely no paperwork, when the back door burst open. Archie McLean stood there, his face the colour of old parchment. Archie was a man who had survived 3 decades of Highland winters and 2 ex-wives with a stoic indifference, but now his hands were shaking so violently that he had to grip the doorframe. "Macbeth," he wheezed. "You'd better come. It's the Englishman, up at the old croft." Hamish felt a heavy, sinking sensation in his stomach, the unmistakable weight of a ruined day. "Is he shouting about the sheep again, Archie? Because if it's just a civil dispute, I'm technically on my break until—" "He's no shouting," Archie interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "He's in his peace pond, the one he dug out of the old sheep dip, and he's very much dead, Hamish. Deader than the mutton I sold to the butcher yesterday." Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound. He looked at his half-finished coffee, then at the rain-lashed window. With the weary resignation of a man walking toward a firing squad, he stood up and pulled on his damp waterproof. "Stay here, Archie. Drink some of Mrs. Curry's tea. Don't tell a soul until I get back." "The whole village'll know by lunch," Mrs. Curry said darkly. "You know how the wind carries a secret in Lochdubh." Hamish and Lugs trekked up the winding, muddy track toward the Sterling estate. The higher they climbed, the more the wind howled, whipping through the ancient pines. When they reached the plateau where the old McCrae Croft stood, the rewilding project looked particularly dismal. The garden was a chaotic mess of dug-up turf and expensive half-planted shrubs that were currently drowning in the deluge. In the centre of what Sterling had called his Zen reflection zone was a circular pond, lined with black plastic and surrounded by jagged decorative stones. Julian Sterling was indeed in the pond. He was face down, his expensive barber jacket inflated with air like a grotesque balloon. But it was the positioning that was truly bizarre. He wasn't just floating, He was wedged into a large, decorative stone Buddha that he had imported from London. His legs were tangled in a set of high-tech underwater LED lights he'd been installing to illuminate the soul. From a distance, it looked like he was trying to perform an underwater somersault and had failed spectacularly. To make matters worse, a small solar-powered fountain in the center of the pond was still working despite the gloom, merrily squirting a pathetic stream of water onto the back of the dead man's head. Hamish stood at the edge of the pond, his hands deep in his pockets. He didn't rush in. He didn't pull out a yellow crime scene tape. He simply looked. His eyes, usually so vacant, were now sharp, darting from the body to the muddy bank, to the gate, and back to the victim's feet. "Aye, lugs," Hamish murmured. "It's a humiliating way to go, drowned in 6 inches of water by your own enlightenment." He noticed something peculiar. Sterling's feet were bare. His expensive leather boots were sitting neatly on the bank, side by side, as if he'd prepared for a swim. But Sterling was a man who hated the cold. He'd complained to the pub about the draught from the door. Why would he strip off his boots in a freezing Highland downpour to step into a muddy sheep dip? Furthermore, there was a faint purplish bruise on the back of Sterling's neck, just visible beneath the hairline, partially obscured by the rhythmic spray of the fountain. Hamish's heart sank further. A simple drowning would have been easy. A tragic accident involving a slippery rock and a Zen Buddha would have meant a few forms and a return to his stove, but that bruise suggested a much more paperwork-heavy reality. "Someone gave him a bit of a help into that pond," Hamish whispered to the dog. He looked down at the mud. Amidst the chaos of footprints, likely Archie's and the victim's, there was a single deep impression of a boot, with a very specific notched heel pattern. It wasn't a farmer's Wellington, and it certainly wasn't Julian's designer footwear. Before Hamish could investigate further, the distant, discordant wail of a siren echoed up the glen. It was the sound of the Strathbane police, which meant DCI Blair. Hamish let out a groan that was almost a physical pain. "Here comes the circus, lugs. Try to look like you don't know anything. It's safer for the both of us." He wiped his muddy hands on his trousers, slumped his shoulders, and adopted the expression of a man who had just discovered that his favourite television show had been cancelled. The lazy Bobby was back on duty. The peace of the glen was not merely broken, it was shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces by the arrival of the Strathbane police. 2 white patrol cars and a dusty black saloon roared up the track, their sirens wailing at the empty hills as if trying to arrest the heather itself. The black saloon fish-tailed in the mud, narrowly missing a dry stone wall before screeching to a halt inches from Hamish's boots. The door flew open, and Detective Chief Inspector Blair emerged like a pressurized canister of rage. Blair was a man whose blood pressure seemed to be his primary hobby. He was short, thick-set, with a face the colour of an overripe plum and a neck that had long ago surrendered to his shirt collar. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice echoing off the crags. "You ginger streak of Highland misery, why haven't you secured this scene? Look at you. You look like a damp tramp who's lost his way to the poorhouse." Hamish took a slow, deliberate sip from a flask of lukewarm tea he'd produced from a deep pocket. He let his jaw hang slightly slack, his eyes widening in a mask of bovine confusion. "Och, sir, I was just making sure the poor soul didn't float away. It's a very slippery pond, you see. Very treacherous for the, spiritually minded." Blair stomped toward the pond, his city shoes sinking into the peat with a squelch that clearly infuriated him. Behind him trailed Detective Sergeants Jimmy Anderson and McNabb. Anderson gave Hamish a weary, knowing nod. He'd worked with Hamish long enough to know the simpleton act usually preceded a very long day for anyone who underestimated the village constable. "Good God," Blair muttered, staring into the water. "What is that? A giant garden gnome?" "It's a Buddha, sir," Hamish supplied helpfully. Mr. Sterling was very keen on the Eastern philosophies, though I doubt the Buddha intended to be used as a murder weapon, or a mooring post. Blair whirled around. Murder? Who said anything about murder? Look at the state of this place. The man's tripped. He's a city boy who didn't know how to walk on a hill. He's tripped over his own vanity, hit his head on the fat man in the middle, and drowned in 6 inches of rainwater. Case closed. Accidental death. I'll have the paperwork done before the pubs open in Strathbane. Is that so, sir? Hamish asked mildly, scratching his ear. Would a man usually take his boots off to have an accidental fall? They're sitting there on the bank, neat as you please, and there's a wee mark on the back of his neck. Quiet, Blair barked. I don't need a village idiot telling me how to read a crime scene. He was going for a dip. He called it a peace pond, didn't he? He was probably trying to commune with the frogs. Blair's eyes scanned the surrounding hillside, landing on the small figure of Archie McLean, who was still standing by the gate, looking miserable. Who's that? Blair demanded, pointing a stubby finger. That's Archie McLean, sir. He's the one who found the body. He's a local crofter. A crofter, eh? Blair's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of a man who had found an easy target. With a grudge, no doubt. Anderson, get over there and grab that man. I heard there was a dispute over grazing rights. Sterling wanted the sheep off. The farmer wanted them on. It's the oldest story in the book. Simple motive, simple suspect, simple arrest. But, sir, Hamish interjected, his voice soft, Archie's 80 if he's a day. He's got the arthritis so bad he can barely lift a dram, let alone hoist a grown man into a pond and hold him there. He's a Highlander, Blair snapped. You lot are made of leather and spite. He probably hit him with a shepherd's crook and pushed him in. Anderson, bring him here. As Archie was led away, protesting in a stream of thick Gaelic and bewildered English, Hamish watched with a heavy heart. He looked back at the muddy bank where he'd seen the notched boot print. Blair's team was already trampling all over it, their heavy regulation boots obliterating the only real evidence on the site. You're a useless article, Macbeth, Blair said, wiping mud from his trousers with a silk handkerchief that quickly became a rag. You've lived here your whole life, and you can't see what's right in front of your nose. Go back to your station and stay by the phone, and for God's sake try to look like a policeman and not a turnip farmer. Yes, sir, Hamish said, casting his eyes downward. Whatever you say, sir. He watched the convoy depart, Archie McLean huddled in the back of a police car like a trapped bird. The silence returned to the glen, broken only by the pathetic splashing of the solar-powered fountain. Hamish looked at Lugs. The dog gave a low, cynical growl. Aye, Hamish whispered. Blair's found his villain, which means the real killer is probably sitting down to a nice lunch, thinking they've gotten away with it. We'd better go for a wander, Lugs. I think it's time we did a bit of mooching. Hamish didn't head for the police station. Instead, he turned his collar up against the wind and started toward the village. He needed to find out who else had been visiting the Zen reflection zone, and he knew exactly which tea tables would have the answers. While DCI Blair was busy in the back of a police van trying to convince a bewildered Archie McLean that he was the Moriarty of the Highlands, Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his own particular brand of forensic science. This involved leaning against the counter of the Lochdubh General Store and Post Office, looking as though his spine had been replaced by a length of damp-cooked spaghetti. Mrs. Garraway, the postmistress, was a woman whose ears were finely tuned to the frequency of village secrets. She was currently sorting the mail with a speed that suggested each envelope held a personal grudge. It's a terrible thing, Mrs. Garraway, Hamish sighed, reaching into a jar on the counter and extracting a ginger nut biscuit with the practiced ease of a professional pickpocket. A man coming here for peace and finding only a watery grave, and poor Archie being hauled off as if he were a common thug. Mrs. Garraway snorted, her spectacles sliding down her nose. Archie McLean couldn't murder a turnip, Hamish Macbeth, and well you know it. But that Sterling? He was a man who invited the lightning. Do you know what he was receiving in the post? Legal stationery. Piles of it. Every day, letters going out to the land court and the council. Hamish chewed his biscuit slowly, his eyes half closed. Legal letters, you say? Was he looking to sue the sheep for trespassing? Worse, she whispered, leaning over the counter. He was trying to challenge the right to roam. He wanted the old path through the glen closed off, said it was disturbing the energetic vibrations of his estate. He was planning to put up a gate, Hamish, a locked gate across the path the school children use. Hamish felt a small, cold spark of interest. In the Highlands, you could steal a man's wife and be forgiven after a decade or two of silence, but if you tried to close an ancient right-of-way, you were declaring war on the very soul of the community. A gate, Hamish mused. That wouldn't make him popular with the Walkers, or the Curry family. They use that path for the hotel deliveries. He didn't care about being popular, Mrs. Garraway said, her voice dropping lower. He had a visitor too, not one of those yoga girls in the orange leggings. A man, sharp-featured like a hawk in a suit. He arrived 2 days ago, didn't come through the village, drove straight up the back track in a car that sounded like a vacuum cleaner. An electric car, Hamish translated. Very modern. And did this hawk man have a name? The mail for the guest was addressed to a Mr. Marcus Thorne. Consultant, it said on the return address. Hamish nodded, memorising the name. He bid Mrs. Garraway a lingering, tragic farewell, mostly because he was eyeing a second biscuit, and wandered back out into the drizzle. He didn't go to the station. Instead, he made his way to the manse. Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, was the undisputed social registrar of Lochdubh. She treated Hamish with a mixture of Christian charity and the weary patience one might show to a particularly slow sheepdog. Hamish, she said, opening the door and immediately ushering him toward the kitchen. I suppose you'll hear about the tragedy. Sit down. You look famished as usual. Within minutes, Hamish was presented with a plate of scones and a pot of tea. This was the mooching at its peak. To Blair, this was a waste of taxpayer money. To Hamish, this was the gathering of intelligence. Mr. Sterling was a very troubled man, Hamish, Mrs. Wellington said, sitting opposite him. He came to see the minister last week. Not for spiritual guidance, mind you. He wanted to know if the church would support his community improvement plan. He offered a very large donation to the roof fund if my husband would speak in favour of the estate expansion at the next community council meeting. And what did the minister say? He told him that the grace of God wasn't for sale, and certainly not for the price of a few slates and a locked gate. Mr. Sterling became quite agitated. He said he had leverage over the village, that he knew why the previous owner of the croft had left so suddenly, and that certain people in Lochdubh wouldn't want the truth coming out. Hamish paused with a scone halfway to his mouth. Leverage? The McRaes left because the farming was poor and the debt was high. Or so we all thought. Sterling didn't think so. He told my husband that Lochdubh was a village built on skeletons and peat. He was a very arrogant man, Hamish. He thought his money made him a king, and he treated the rest of us like his subjects. Hamish finished his tea, his mind whirring behind his blank expression. Julian Sterling had been a man who collected enemies like other men collected stamps. He was suing the locals, bribing the church, and threatening to expose secrets. As he walked back toward the village centre, lugs trotting at his heels, Hamish saw the silver lining of the case. Blair was looking for a man with a motive, but in Lochdubh, Julian Sterling had given practically everyone a reason to want him face down in his own peace pond. The problem wasn't finding a suspect. It was finding the one who had actually been bothered to do the job. And then there was the matter of Marcus Thorne, the consultant, who had arrived in a silent car and hadn't been seen since the body was found. It's getting complicated, Lugs, Hamish murmured, and when things get complicated, I usually need someone with a better class of gossip to help me sort the wheat from the chaff. He turned his gaze toward the large grey stone bulk of the Halbert and Smythe estate. It was time to see Priscilla. If the village was a collection of secrets buried in peat, Tommel Castle was a monument to secrets polished until they shone like the family silver. As Hamish climbed the long winding drive, the rain began to thin, replaced by a biting wind that rattled the ancient larches. The castle, the ancestral home of the Halbert and Smythes, loomed over the loch with a stony indifference to the petty dramas of the common folk. Hamish didn't head for the grand front entrance. He knew his place, or at least he knew the place that caused the least amount of fuss. He skirted around to the side terrace, where the floor-to-ceiling windows of the morning room looked out over the gardens. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was standing by the window, a book in her hand and a look of elegant boredom on her face. Even in a simple wool sweater and trousers, she possessed a cool, unattainable beauty that had been the undoing of Hamish's peace of mind for years. She saw him, and for a fleeting second, a genuine smile touched her lips before she masked it with a look of mild exasperation. She opened the French doors, letting in a swirl of cold air and a damp dog. "Honestly, Hamish, you look like something the sea washed up. And Lugs is dripping on the rug. Do come in before you catch your death." "Oh, I wouldn't want to be a bother, Priscilla," Hamish said, stepping inside and immediately looking for a place to sit that didn't involve velvet. "But the wind has a bit of a bite, and I was wondering if you'd heard the news from the old McCrae Croft." "The whole county has heard, Hamish. My father is currently in the library, trying to decide whether he should be appalled by the murder or relieved that Mr. Sterling won't be attending the next planning committee meeting." She led him toward the small breakfast parlour, where a tray of delicate cucumber sandwiches and a silver teapot sat. "I take it Blair is already making a mess of things. He's arrested Archie McLean," Hamish said, accepting a sandwich and finishing it in one bite. "He thinks Archie is a Highland ninja who can hoist a man into a pond without ruffling his own beard." Priscilla sat across from him, her blue eyes sharp. "That's ridiculous. Archie can barely climb the stairs at the pub. But Julian Sterling was a man who went out of his way to be loathed. He wasn't just a nuisance, Hamish. He was a predator. He made his money in London by restructuring failing companies, which usually meant firing everyone and selling the lead off the roofs. So he wasn't just a man who liked trees and yoga. Hardly. He was under immense pressure. There were rumours in the financial papers that his latest fund had collapsed. He didn't come to Lochdubh for the vibrations, Hamish. He came here to hide from people he owed money to. And Marcus Thorne, the man staying with him, he's not a consultant. He's a specialist in, let's call it, debt recovery for the very wealthy." Hamish paused, a second sandwich halfway to his mouth. "A debt collector? Mrs. Garraway said he looked like a hawk. I don't think he's the type to push a man into a pond. Too much mess. A professional would just use a gun, wouldn't they?" "Perhaps," Priscilla mused. "But Thorne isn't the only one who was interested in Sterling. Did you know Sterling was trying to buy up the mineral rights for the entire glen? He'd found an old map suggesting there was a vein of high-grade copper, or perhaps even gold in the hills behind the village. He was trying to force the locals to sell their grazing rights so he could start exploratory drilling." Hamish felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with his wet socks. Gold in Lochdubh? That would bring in the big companies. It would ruin the glen. It would bring in roads and hotels and tourists in buses. Precisely. And he was using that leverage. Mrs. Wellington mentioned to blackmail anyone who stood in his way. He'd done his homework, Hamish. He knew who was behind on their taxes, who had a hidden past, and who was poaching more than the occasional salmon. She gave him a pointed look. Hamish looked away, suddenly very interested in the pattern on the teapot. "Aye, well, a man has to eat. But blackmail? That's a dangerous game to play in a place where everyone has a shovel and plenty of places to hide a body." "There's something else," Priscilla said, leaning forward. "The pond. Sterling was obsessed with it. He told my father it was the centre of his power. He'd hired a firm from Edinburgh to build it, but he fired them halfway through and finished it himself. He said he didn't trust anyone with the final alignment." "The final alignment," Hamish repeated. "With a plastic Buddha and some fairy lights?" It sounds absurd, but Sterling was a man of patterns. He believed that if you controlled the landscape, you controlled the people. He was quite mad, in a very expensive London sort of way. Hamish stood up, his mind clicking through the pieces. A debt collector on the premises, a village under the threat of blackmail and industrial mining, and a victim who was finishing his own construction work. And then there were the boots, the neat, dry boots on the bank. "You've been a great help, Priscilla," Hamish said, reaching for one last sandwich for the road. "Be careful, Hamish," she said, her voice softening. "Blair is looking for a scapegoat, and if you get in his way, he'll be more than happy to make it you. And do try to dry your hair. You look like a very stressed carrot." "I'll do my best," Hamish grinned. As he walked back down the drive, the lazy expression had vanished from his face. He knew now that the murder wasn't a sudden outburst of Highland temper. It was a calculated move. Someone had known exactly when Sterling would be at that pond, and someone had known that the Peace Pond wasn't just for reflection. He needed to look at that pond again, but first he had to find out where Marcus Thorne had disappeared to, because a hawk doesn't fly away until it's finished its meal. The Lochdubh police station, usually a place of quiet contemplation and the occasional smell of Hamish's burning toast, had been transformed into a war room. DCI Blair had commandeered Hamish's desk, which was now buried under a mountain of half-eaten takeaway containers and urgent folders that Blair was pointedly ignoring in favour of shouting into a telephone. In the corner, Archie McLean sat on a hard wooden chair, looking smaller and more fragile than usual. He was still wearing his muddy tweed jacket, and his eyes were fixed on his own gnarled hands. "I'm telling you, it's a slam dunk," Blair yelled into the receiver, presumably to the chief constable. "The motive is as old as the hills, land and spite. I've got the murder weapon right here, a heavy shepherd's crook stained with the victim's blood. The old man's cracked. I'll have a confession before the tea's cold." Blair slammed the phone down and turned his predatory gaze toward Hamish, who was standing by the window, appearing to be deeply fascinated by a moth fluttering against the glass. "Still here, Macbeth? I thought I told you to go patrol the pier and stay out of the way of real police work." "I was just wondering, sir," Hamish said, his voice hesitant and thin, "about that crook, Archie's crook. It was in the back of his Land Rover, was it no?" "Exactly, hidden in plain sight, covered in dark, sticky residue. Our forensics boys in the van say it's an organic match." Hamish wandered over to the evidence bag sitting on the table. Inside was the crook, a sturdy piece of hazel with a horn handle. Near the base there were indeed dark, brownish-red smears. "It's just that—" Hamish scratched his head, looking like he was struggling with a very basic addition problem. "Archie's been helping with the late lambing up at the Forbes farm, and that blood looks an awful lot like raddle, the paint we used to mark the ewes, mixed with a bit of birthing fluid. It has a very specific smell, sir. A bit like, well, like a wet sheep, not like a murdered Londoner." Blair's face turned a shade of purple that almost matched the raddle. "Don't you start with your local knowledge nonsense. Blood is blood until the lab says otherwise. And what about the footprints? The notched heel we found at the scene? I've seized Archie's boots. They're a perfect match." "Are they, sir?" Hamish asked mildly. "I thought the prints at the pond were a size 11, very deep, very heavy. I noticed them before the rain washed the edges away. So, McLean's a big man." "Archie," Hamish said, looking over at the Crofter, "what size are your feet?" Archie looked up, blinking. "I've been a size 8 since the year of the Great Snow, Hamish, and I only wear the Dunlop Wellingtons. They don't have a notched heel. They've got the V-tread for the mud." Blair lunged for the evidence bag containing Archie's boots. He ripped it open and stared at the soles. They were indeed size 8, smooth-treaded and remarkably clean compared to the deep, heavy-notched marks left in the Zen Zone mud. "He could have changed them," Blair roared. "He could have bought special boots just for the murder. A cold-blooded, calculating killer." "Archie can barely afford a new set of spark plugs for the tractor, sir," Hamish pointed out. "I doubt he's keeping a murder wardrobe of expensive English hiking boots in a size too big for him." Hamish leaned against the wall, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "And then there's the matter of Kayleach." "Who?" "Archie's dog. She's a border collie with a very nervous disposition. If Archie had gone up to that pond at night, which is when you say the murder happened, Kayleach would have been howling the glen down. She hates the water and she hates the dark. But Mrs. Wallace, who lives in the cottage at the foot of the track, says it was as quiet as a grave all night. Not a peep from the McLean dogs. Blair threw the boots back onto the table with a snarl. Fine, so the old man's a dead end. That doesn't mean it isn't a local, it just means I need to find the one with the big feet. Actually, sir, Hamish said, looking down at his own feet, I noticed something else about the victim when I saw him in the pond. He was wearing his barber jacket and his expensive trousers, but his boots were on the bank. They were bone dry inside, not a drop of rain in them. Blair paused. So? He took them off before it started raining. But it's been raining since 4 in the afternoon yesterday, sir. Constant like. If he'd taken them off to commune with the frogs at midnight, they'd be full of water. The only way those boots stayed dry inside is if they were placed there after he was already in the water and covered by something, like a waterproof, until the killer took the waterproof away. Hamish let that sink in. The lazy Bobby had just dismantled Blair's entire case with the observation of a pair of dry socks. The killer didn't just push him, sir, Hamish whispered. The killer staged the scene. They wanted us to think it was a tragic, eccentric accident. They even put his boots out for him, like a valet. It wasn't a crime of passion by a local crofter. It was a very tidy, very cold-blooded piece of work. Blair glared at Hamish, his hatred for the constable's competence momentarily outweighing his desire to make an arrest. Get out, Macbeth, and take this old fool with you. But don't think you're off the hook. If I find out you're hiding the real killer to protect your community, I'll have your badge on a plate. Hamish ushered a shaking Archie out of the station. As they stepped into the fresh Highland air, Archie gripped Hamish's arm. Thank you, Hamish. I thought for sure I was heading for the Barlinnie. Och, don't worry about Blair, Archie. He's like a midgie. Annoying, but he doesn't have much of a brain. But tell me, did you see anyone else near the croft yesterday? Anyone with, let's say, very large, very expensive boots? Archie frowned, thinking hard. I didn't see a man, but I saw a car. Not the electric one the Hawk fellow has, a big black thing. It was parked in the trees, by the old quarry. It had a sticker on the back, a little gold crest. Hamish's heart gave a little thump. A gold crest. Go home, Archie, get some tea, and keep Kayleach inside. Hamish watched Archie limp away. The red herring had been cleared, but the real predator was still in the woods, and if there was a gold crest involved, the petty secrets of Lochdubh were about to get a lot more dangerous. The evening brought a treacherous frost that turned the mud of Lochdubh into iron. Inside his small police cottage, Hamish Macbeth ignored the official blue flickering of his radio and focused instead on the rhythmic bubbling of a pot of mutton stew. The scent of onions, carrots, and cheap meat filled the room, a fragrant defiance against the cold Highland night. Lugg sat by the stove, his eyes tracking every movement of the wooden spoon. It's never about the big things, Luggs, Hamish murmured, leaning back and lighting a cracked pipe. Outsiders like Blair think folk kill for millions or for international conspiracies. But in the Highlands, folk kill for the small things. They kill for a bit of pride, a 30-year-old grudge, or the fear of being laughed at in the pub. He thought back to what Priscilla had said about the mineral rights, and what Mrs. Wellington had whispered about leverage. Julian Sterling hadn't been a man interested in the earth for the sake of the trees. He was a man who looked for cracks in companies, cracks in bank accounts, and cracks in people's lives. He had hired a local man to help him navigate the complex web of Highland land ownership, Donald Ross. Donald Ross was the village's invisible professional, a surveyor and land agent with a silver tongue and a wardrobe of expensive, understated tweeds. Ross was the man who handled the paperwork for the big estates. He was the one who knew exactly where the boundaries lay, who owed what to whom, and which crofts were ripe for redevelopment. He was a man of immense local standing, the secretary of the Highland Games Committee, and a man who took great pride in his gentleman status. Hamish puffed on his pipe, his eyes half closed. He remembered seeing Ross's black Volvo, the one with the gold crest of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors on the window, parked near the hotel earlier that week, a gold crest. Now then, Hamish whispered to the empty room, If I were a man like Donald Ross, who spent 30 years building a reputation as a pillar of the community, what would Julian Sterling have found that would make me want to hold his head underwater? The leverage. Hamish stood up and went to a dusty filing cabinet in the corner of the room. He pulled out a folder of old maps and land deeds he'd borrowed from the council offices months ago when he was bored. He spread them across the kitchen table, pushing aside a crust of bread. He looked at the McCrae Croft. The old Macraes hadn't just left because of bad luck. According to the records, their land had been sold in a private treaty to a holding company based in Jersey, a company represented by Donald Ross. The sale price was a pittance. A year later, Ross had discovered that the land was perfect for high-end development and sold it to Sterling for a fortune. But Sterling was a shark. He wouldn't have just paid the bill and said thank you. He would have looked into the Jersey company. He would have found out that Donald Ross was the Jersey company. Ross had essentially stolen the land from the illiterate, grieving McCrae widow and pocketed the difference. But that's just white-collar crime, Hamish mused. Ross could have survived a scandal with a good lawyer and a move to Edinburgh. There had to be something more, something petty. He remembered the pond. Sterling had fired the Edinburgh builders and finished the final alignment himself. Why? Because when they started digging, they found something that wasn't on the map. Not gold, not copper. Hamish recalled a fragment of village gossip from 20 years ago, a travelling salesman who had disappeared near the glen, or perhaps a local lad who had gone to sea and never written home. If Ross had been involved in a disappearance to cover his early tracks, and Sterling had found the evidence in the peat while digging his Zen pond, Sterling wouldn't have called the police. He would have enjoyed it. He would have made Donald Ross, the great surveyor, his peasant. He would have made him fetch and carry, made him sign over more land, and made him the laughingstock of the county. To a man like Ross, death was preferable to being mocked. "The boots, lugs," Hamish said, his voice sharpening. "The dry boots on the bank. That wasn't just to make it look like an accident. It was a sign of respect. Even when he was killing him, Ross couldn't help being proper. He couldn't leave a gentleman's boots to get ruined in the mud. He's a man obsessed with appearances." He looked down at the map. There was a specific notched pattern on the heels of the boots Ross wore, the Hunter Sovereign model, the choice of the professional land agent. Size 11. Hamish sighed. He had the motive, he had the suspect, and he had the how. But Blair wouldn't listen to a theory about pride and land deeds. He needed to make the predator show his teeth. "It's time to set a trap, lugs, and for that, we'll need a bit of Highland theatre." He reached for his hat. He wasn't going to the station. He was going to the pub, where Donald Ross was currently holding court, pretending that his world wasn't about to collapse into the peat. The public bar of the Lochdubh Hotel was thick with the scent of damp wool, peat smoke, and the low, urgent murmur of a village under siege. News of Archie MacLean's release had spread faster than a winter flu, but the atmosphere remained brittle. The locals knew that if it wasn't Archie, Blair would soon come looking for a new neck to fit his noose. Hamish Macbeth pushed open the heavy oak door, looking like a man who had carried the weight of the Quillins on his shoulders. He didn't go to his usual corner. Instead, he slumped onto a stool at the bar, right next to Donald Ross. Ross looked every inch the morning professional. He was sipping a glass of expensive single malt, his expression one of grave civic concern. He looked down at Hamish with the faint, patronising pity of a man who owned 3 suits that cost more than Hamish's annual salary. "A bad business, Hamish," Ross said, his voice a smooth, practised baritone. "I hear the DCI from Strathbane is, shall we say, a man of limited patience. I trust Archie is holding up. Oh, he's as well as a man can be when he's been accused of being a master criminal." Hamish sighed, staring gloomily into an empty glass until Billy, the barman, took the hint and poured him a dram. "Blair is in a foul temper, Donald. He's convinced there's a conspiracy. He's calling in the underwater search unit from Glasgow for tomorrow morning. Ross's hand, perfectly manicured and steady, paused for a fraction of a second on his glass. The underwater unit? For a 6-inch pond? That seems excessive. Aye, well, it's not the water they're interested in, Hamish whispered, leaning closer so his voice carried just far enough. It's the Buddha. You see, Sterling wasn't just a yoga enthusiast. He was a paranoid man. He told the postmistress he was recording the vibrations of the glen. Ross tilted his head. Recording them? With what? A tiny digital recorder, Hamish said, looking around as if checking for spies. Hidden in the base of that stone statue. It's one of those modern things, voice-activated, runs for weeks. Blair doesn't know about it yet. I only found the mention of it in Sterling's diary an hour ago. It's likely sitting right there, under the Buddha's belly, in a waterproof casing. Hamish took a long pull of his whiskey and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. The problem is, the frost is getting into the stone. If that casing cracks and the water gets in before the Glasgow boys arrive at dawn, the evidence will be ruined. And then Blair will have my head for not securing it tonight. Then why aren't you up there now, man? Ross asked, his eyes suddenly very sharp. Oh, my torch is broken, and Luggs has a sore paw, Hamish grumbled, sounding like the epitome of Highland laziness. And besides, it's freezing. I thought I'd have one more dram, go home for a bit of stew, and head up there around midnight when the moon's up. It'll be easier to find the release catch then. Midnight, Ross repeated softly. Quite a walk in the dark. Aye. But if that recorder has the killer's voice on it, well, even a useless article like me would get a commendation for that. Maybe even a transfer to a nice warm office in Inverness. Hamish gave a shudder of practiced horror. God forbid. Perhaps I'll just accidentally drop it in the deep part of the loch on the way back. Ross laughed, a dry, hollow sound. You're a true original, Hamish. Always looking for the path of least resistance. It's the only way to live, Donald. Hamish finished his drink, stood up with a theatrical groan, and nodded to the room. He walked out of the pub, his shoulders hunched against the wind. As soon as the door closed and he was in the shadows of the stone gable, Hamish's posture changed. He straightened up, his eyes turning cold and alert. He didn't head for his cottage. He slipped through the narrow alley behind the grocery store and began a long, looping climb through the gorse and heather, keeping well away from the main track. He knew Donald Ross. Ross was a man who lived for his reputation. The idea of a digital recording, even the slim possibility of one, would be an intolerable threat to his carefully constructed life. Ross wouldn't risk the Glasgow team finding it. He wouldn't even risk Hamish losing it. He would want to destroy it himself, and he would want to do it before the moon was high enough for anyone else to see him. Hamish reached the ridge overlooking the McRae Croft. The Zen reflection zone lay below him, a dark silver-grey circle in the moonlight. The solar fountain had finally died for the night, leaving the scene in a heavy, expectant silence. Luggs sat beside him, a silent shadow. "Now we wait, Luggs," Hamish whispered. A man who spends his life measuring land usually forgets that the land is also measuring him. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The only sound was the distant pulse of the sea, then the faint rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen gravel. A dark figure emerged from the tree line, moving with a grace that didn't belong to a farmer. The figure reached the edge of the pond and stopped, looking around. The moonlight caught the polished surface of a black Volvo parked half a mile down the road, but the man was now on foot. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy professional-grade flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing directly on the stone Buddha. Hamish watched as Donald Ross, the pillar of the community, the great surveyor, stepped into the freezing water of the pond, his expensive boots submerged, and began to frantically feel around the base of the statue. "Looking for something, Donald?" Hamish's voice drifted down from the ridge, calm and conversational, like a neighbour greeting a friend over a fence. The flashlight beam jerked upward, shaking in the darkness. The flashlight beam whipped across the dark hillside, the light dancing erratically over gorse bushes and jagged rocks before finally pinning Hamish Macbeth in its cold, white glare. Hamish didn't flinch. He stood with his thumbs hooked into his belt, looking for all the world like a man waiting for a bus that was running slightly behind schedule. "It's a bit chilly for a paddle, Donald," Hamish said, his voice carrying clearly on the freezing air. "Especially in those fine boots. I thought a man of your standing would know that Highland peat never truly lets go of what it catches." Donald Ross stood frozen in the centre of the pond, the water swirling around his shins. His face, usually a mask of professional composure, was now a distorted map of panic and burgeoning rage. He lowered the flashlight slightly, the beam illuminating the pathetic stone Buddha between them. "You're a cleverer man than you look, Macbeth," Ross spat, his voice losing its velvet polish. "But you're still a fool. There is no recorder, is there? I felt every inch of this ridiculous statue. You lied." "Oh, well," Hamish drawled, beginning a slow, cautious descent down the slippery bank. "A lie is such a harsh word. I prefer to think of it as a conversational lure. And it worked, didn't it? Only the man who knew Julian Sterling had a reason to hide a secret would come looking for a way to erase it. He was going to ruin me." Ross's voice rose to a jagged edge. "He found the surveyor, the one who disappeared in '94. The poor bastard was buried right where you're standing, under the old foundation. Sterling was digging his peace pond and hit bone. He didn't call the police, Hamish. He called me. He laughed. He made me get down on my knees and scrub his kitchen floor just to show he owned me. And so you waited until he was distracted by his lights and his energies, and you gave him a nudge," Hamish said, now only a few feet from the water's edge. "You held him down, Donald. You're a strong man for your age. All that golf and hill walking." Ross's eyes darted toward the tree line, then back to Hamish. The realization that his life, the committees, the gold-crested Volvo, the respect of the county was evaporating into the night air seemed to snap something inside him. He wasn't a criminal by trade, but a man who had committed one murder to cover a theft and a second to cover the first becomes a creature of desperate instinct. "No one will believe you," Ross hissed. "It's your word against mine. A lazy village copper with a poached salmon in his history and a dog that can't even bark on command. Actually, Lugs is very good at commands," Hamish said mildly. "He just chooses to ignore them." "But the mud, Donald. The mud doesn't ignore anything. You're standing in the evidence. Those boots have the notched heel I found in the bank, and when I call the forensic boys to properly dig under this pond, they'll find your old friend from '94. With a roar of pure animalistic frustration, Ross lunged. He didn't go for a weapon. He used the heavy industrial-grade flashlight like a club. He surged out of the water, the weight of his momentum catching Hamish off guard on the slick grass. They collided and went down in a tangle of limbs and wet wool. For a man who looked like he spent his days napping by a stove, Hamish was surprisingly solid, a mass of lean muscle honed by miles of walking the glens. He caught Ross's wrist, the flashlight thudding into the soft earth inches from his head. "Give it up, Donald," Hamish wheezed, rolling to the side. "You're making a mess of your jacket." Ross was beyond caring about his tailoring. He scrambled on top of Hamish, his fingers clawing for the copper's throat. He was fueled by the frantic strength of a man who saw the prison gates yawning open. Suddenly, a heavy, hairy weight hit Ross from the side. Lugs, usually the most pacifist of creatures, had decided that the entertainment had gone on long enough. He didn't bite. That would be too much effort, but he threw his entire substantial bulk into Ross's ribs with the force of a falling sack of coal. Ross tumbled back into the freezing water. With a spectacular splash, he landed hard against the stone Buddha, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs in a sharp, wet gasp. Hamish was up in an instant. He didn't use a baton. He simply stepped into the water, grabbed Ross by the collar of his expensive tweed coat, and hauled him upward. With a quick, practiced motion, he twisted Ross's arm behind his back and shoved his face toward the stone statue. "There now," Hamish panted, his ginger hair plastered to his face, looking entirely unheroic and thoroughly annoyed. "You wanted to commune with the Buddha, Donald. Now's your chance. You're under arrest for the murder of Julian Sterling, and I suspect we'll be having a long chat about 1994 as well." Ross slumped, the fight draining out of him as the icy water soaked into his skin. He looked small, wet, and utterly defeated. Hamish looked down at his own ruined trousers and sighed. "Look at the state of us. Blair's going to have a field day with the dry cleaning bill. Come on, then. Let's get you to the station before I lose my temper and leave you here to re-wild with the rest of the rubbish." The lights of the Lochdubh police station burned with a harsh, unforgiving glare against the early morning mist. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of wet dogs, stale coffee, and DCI Blair's mounting disbelief. Donald Ross sat in the small interview room, his head in his hands, his once immaculate tweed jacket looking like a discarded floorcloth. He had spent the last 2 hours weeping and confessing to everything from the 1994 disappearance to the exact moment he'd pushed Julian Sterling into the pond. Blair stood in the main office, pacing like a caged bull. He looked at the typed confession, then at Hamish, who was currently sitting on the edge of a desk, trying to dry his socks over a small electric heater. "You're telling me," Blair growled, his face a dangerous shade of magenta, "that you lured a pillar of the community to a crime scene in the middle of the night using a fake story about a digital recorder? A story you made up?" "It was a theoretical possibility, sir," Hamish said innocently, wiggling his toes. "In the Highlands, folk are very interested in modern technology. I just thought Donald might want to see if it was working." Blair slammed his hand down on the desk, making a stack of forms jump. "It's entrapment. It's procedural suicide." "If the chief constable hears that a village bobby solved a double homicide by lying through his teeth and rolling around in a pond with a land agent, I'll be the laughingstock of Strathbane." Hamish looked up, his expression one of deep, cow-like concern. "Och, sir, I see what you mean. It would look very bad for the department. People might think the CID couldn't find a body in a bathtub without help from the local parish." Blair froze. He looked at Hamish, his eyes narrowing. He knew this look. It was the look Hamish gave him right before Blair was handed a victory he hadn't earned. "What are you suggesting, Macbeth?" "Well, sir," Hamish drawled, "if I were to write the report, I'd have to mention my, unorthodox methods. But if you were to write the report, it might look a bit different. You could say that through your brilliant analysis of the footprints and the leverage Sterling had over the community, you identified Donald Ross as the primary suspect. You could say you'd been tailing him for hours, and that I was merely the, bait you used to draw him out into the open." Blair's breathing slowed. The purple hue of his face began to fade into a more manageable pink. "Bait, you say?" "Aye. You realized that Ross was a man of high ego. You instructed me to spread the rumor of the recorder at the pub to see if he'd bite. You were waiting in the tree line, very stealthy-like, ready to pounce when the killer revealed himself. I just happened to be the one who got my trousers wet during the struggle while you coordinated the perimeter." A slow, predatory smile began to spread across Blair's face. "I did notice the discrepancy in the land deeds early on," Blair lied, his voice regaining its usual arrogant boom. "And I told Anderson that Ross was acting suspiciously at the hotel. It was a classic pressure cooker investigation. I squeezed the village until the truth popped out. Exactly, sir, Hamish encouraged. A masterclass in psychological profiling. They'll likely want to give you a commendation in Inverness, maybe even a special feature in the Police Gazette. Blair puffed out his chest. It's all in a day's work, Macbeth. Though I suppose I should mention you in the footnotes. Assisted by local personnel or some such. Oh, don't bother yourself with that, sir, Hamish said quickly, waving a hand. I'd hate for the paperwork to get complicated. In fact, if you could just make sure the report emphasizes that I acted under direct and constant supervision, it would save a lot of questions from the higher-ups. Blair nodded vigorously. The last thing he wanted was for Hamish Macbeth to look like a hero. If Hamish looked like a hero, people started talking about promotions. If people talked about promotions, Blair might have to work with the ginger nuisance in Strathbane every single day. Right. Anderson, McNabb, Blair shouted, heading for the door. Get the cars ready. We're taking Ross back to the city. I've got a press release to draft. And Macbeth. Hamish looked up from his heater. Yes, sir. Clean this place up. It smells like a swamp. And get a proper uniform. You're a disgrace to the service. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. Hamish watched through the window as the police convoy screamed out of Lochdubh, sirens wailing for no reason other than Blair's own self-importance. The village grew quiet again, the mist beginning to lift to reveal a pale, watery sun. Lugs gave a long, appreciative yawn and stretched out by the door. There they go, Lugs, Hamish whispered. Another career saved by a bit of Highland wind. And the best part is, we don't have to go to Inverness. We can stay right here, where the only thing we have to worry about is what's for breakfast. He turned off the heater, pulled on his still-damp boots, and headed for the kitchen. He had a sudden, pressing need for a very large pot of coffee and perhaps a slice of Mrs. Curry's black pudding. The peace of Lochdubh had been restored, and as far as the world was concerned, Hamish Macbeth was still the laziest policeman in Scotland. The following morning broke with a rare crystalline clarity. The rain had finally exhausted itself, leaving the Highlands scrubbed clean. The air was sharp and sweet with the scent of pine and salt, and the waters of the loch were as still and reflective as a dark silk sheet. Hamish Macbeth stood on the pier, leaning against a rusted bollard. He was dressed in his best uniform, the one that didn't have a tea stain on the lapel, and was watching the morning ferry pull away. He looked, to any passing tourist, like a picture postcard policeman, serene, stalwart, and entirely ornamental. "It's a grand day, Hamish," a voice called out. He turned to see Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She was dressed in a tailored hacking jacket, her blonde hair caught in the breeze. She looked at him with an expression that was halfway between amusement and admiration. "I see the papers are full of DCI Blair's tactical brilliance," she said, tapping a folded copy of the Strathbane Standard against her palm. Apparently he personally masterminded the sting operation that brought down the Lochdubh land shark. Not a single mention of a red-haired constable and a dog with a grudge. Hamish grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Oh, well, Blair needs the glory, Priscilla. It keeps him busy in the city. If I took the credit, I'd be sitting in a fluorescent-lit office in Glasgow, filling out forms about bicycle thefts and listening to the hum of a vending machine. Here, I have the loch, the hills, and the company of a very discerning dog, and a village that knows exactly who to thank," she added softly. "Mrs. Garraway told me she's accidentally misplaced the bill for your tobacco this month, and Archie McLean was seen dropping off a crate of eggs at your back door at dawn. It's a terrible thing, the corruption in this village." Hamish sighed contentedly. "I try to keep them on the straight and narrow, but they're a headstrong lot." They stood in silence for a moment, watching a seal bob its head above the water. The tension of the past few days had evaporated, replaced by the slow, rhythmic pulse of Highland life. Julian Sterling's rewilding project would likely be tied up in probate for years. The Zen pond would eventually fill with tadpoles and peat, and the Peace Pond would become just another local landmark with a dark story attached to it. "Will you be coming up to the castle for tea later?" Priscilla asked, turning to go. "My father wants to ask your opinion on the new poaching laws. He thinks they're far too lenient." "I'll see if my busy schedule allows it," Hamish said with a straight face. "But I have a very important appointment with a pot of stew first." As Priscilla walked away, Hamish felt a familiar thud against his leg. Luggs was looking up at him, his tongue lolling out, clearly suggesting that the important appointment should begin immediately. Hamish walked back through the village, nodding to the locals. He stopped by the hotel to return a borrowed thermos and was met with a celebratory plate of kippers from Mrs. Curry, who didn't say thank you, but gave him an extra-large portion of butter. Back in his small police cottage, the fire was already crackling in the stove. Hamish settled into his worn armchair, the one with the spring that poked him if he didn't sit exactly right. He poured himself a mug of coffee, strong, black, and hot enough to scald, and opened a book. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the soft snoring of Luggs on the rug. Out the window, the shadows of the clouds raced across the mountainside, turning the heather from purple to charcoal and back again. He was a man of no ambition, no property, and very little money. But as he sat there, the warmth of the fire on his shins and the peace of the glen settled around him like a familiar cloak. He had protected his home. He had seen justice done in his own quiet way, and most importantly, he had ensured that he wouldn't have to leave. "Aye, Luggs," Hamish murmured, closing his eyes. "It's a hard life being a policeman in the Highlands. But someone has to do it." Within minutes the book had slipped from his hand, and PC Hamish Macbeth, the smartest man in the county and the laziest man in the village, was fast asleep. The silver Range Rover was no longer silver. It was coated in a thick, egalitarian layer of Highland muck, looking like a high-fashion model who had been forced to work a double shift in a peat bog. Marcus Thorne, the man Mrs. Garraway had likened to a hawk, stood by the driver's door, looking out over Lochdubh with an expression of profound, weary defeat. The consultant had spent 48 hours being grilled by DCI Blair's subordinates, and while he had no hand in the murder, his reputation as a financial shark had been bloodied by the sheer, stubborn incompetence of the local bureaucracy. Hamish Macbeth wandered down to the pier where the car was parked, waiting for the ferry. He was holding a small, weathered piece of parchment, the very map that had fueled Julian Sterling's dreams of mineral wealth and industrial glory. "Leaving us so soon, Mr. Thorne?" Hamish asked, his voice a gentle, rhythmic drawl. "I thought you might stay to see the energetic vibrations settle back into the hills." Thorne turned, his sharp features tightened by a lack of sleep. "This place is a graveyard of ambition, Macbeth. Sterling was a fool. He thought he could buy the soul of a place like this. He didn't realize that in the Highlands the land doesn't belong to the people belong to the land, and the land is very, very hungry." "Aye," Hamish said, looking at the map. "It has a way of swallowing things. Money, cars, and men. Speaking of Sterling's ambitions, I had a wee look at this map of his, the one that suggested there was a vein of gold running behind the old Macrae Croft." Thorne scoffed. "The geological survey he commissioned. He spent £50,000 on that data. He was convinced he'd be the man who turned the Highlands into the next Klondike." Hamish handed the paper to Thorne. "I took the liberty of showing this to Geordie Macrae. He's 94, and his memory is a bit like the mist, but he knows those hills better than his own palms. He told me that map doesn't show gold. It shows the old drainage vents from the Victorian iron works. What Sterling thought was a high-grade mineral deposit was actually just iron pyrites. Fool's gold, Mr. Thorne. A massive, concentrated pocket of it." Thorne stared at the map, a slow, bitter realization dawning in his eyes. So it was all for nothing. The leverage, the blackmail, the land grabs. He was fighting a war over a pile of worthless yellow rock. "It's a common mistake for folk from the south," Hamish said mildly. "They see the glitter and they think it's a fortune. We Highlanders see the glitter, and we know it just means the water's going to taste like rust for a week." Thorne crumpled the map into a ball and threw it into a nearby bin. "You're a strange man, Macbeth. You sit here and watch the world go by, and you don't seem to want a piece of it." "Oh, I have enough," Hamish replied, watching the ferry's ramp lower with a heavy clang. "I have a roof that only leaks in a gale, a dog that keeps my feet warm, and a village where no one expects me to be anything other than a nuisance. In London, that might be called a failure. In Lochdubh, we call it a successful career." Thorne climbed into his mud-caked vehicle without another word. As the ferry pulled away, carrying the last of the outsider influence back toward the mainland, Hamish stood on the pier until the wake of the boat had smoothed back into the dark glass of the loch. The village was quiet. The rewilding signs had already been torn down by mysterious nocturnal forces, likely the same forces that had returned Archie MacLean's sheep to their rightful grazing grounds on the hill. The old McCrae croft would stand empty for a while, its zen pond slowly filling with weeds and the occasional misplaced Wellington boot, until the Highlands eventually reclaimed the stone and the plastic Buddha alike. Hamish made his way back to the Lochdubh Hotel. The evening session was just beginning, and the windows were beginning to glow with a warm amber light. As he pushed open the door, a cheer went up from the corner table. "Here he is," Archie MacLean shouted, waving a glass of Talisker. "The man who saved us from the gold diggers." "Quiet now, Archie," Hamish laughed, taking his seat. "I did nothing but watch a man drown in his own vanity. It's a spectator sport in these parts." Billy the barman slid a dram across the counter before Hamish could even reach for his wallet. "On the house, Hamish, for services to the community. Mrs. Garraway says the post is much quieter now that the lawyers have stopped writing." Hamish took a sip of the whiskey, feeling the fire of the peat and the salt of the sea sliding down his throat. He looked around the room, at the weather-beaten faces of the Crofters, the sharp eyes of the postmistress, and the comfortable, grumbling presence of Mrs. Curry. They were a difficult, stubborn, secretive people. They were his people. And as long as he could keep the ambitious at bay and the Sassenachs at arm's length, life in Lochdubh would continue its slow, beautiful, and slightly crooked dance. "To the Highlands," Hamish whispered, lifting his glass to the shadows in the corner, "where the only thing worth digging for is a good story." He leaned back, the lazy Bobby once more, his mind already drifting toward the possibility of a late-night poaching trip. After all, the salmon were running, and DCI Blair was safely miles away, busy writing a report about a genius he would never truly understand.